Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's Tuesday topic. Today's topic is ethically speaking on artificial intelligence. And today our presenter is Dr. Connie Perry, who is a health ethicist in our health administration department. And also helping her is Dr. Fran Cornelius, who is online and will be pitching in at various points. All right. And without further ado, let me throw it over to you, Connie. Step on it.
Hey. Okay, so we're going to talk about some ethical tools for AI use in healthcare research and education. And this is very much a work in progress. So jump in with questions as we go along. Okay, so we're going to go over some aspects of AI because I think understanding that helps you understand some of the potential ethical benefits and problems and some of the challenges that come through. Talk about some of the guiding principles, which are a little bit different than some of your classic. There's an overlap, but there's some other principles we need to consider. We're going to have a couple of cases to discuss with questions and discussion. So I'm going to focus on ChatGPT as an example of a multifaceted large language model. Understanding I think what GPT stands for is helpful. So it stands for generative pre-trained transformers. So the generative part is where you get the creative answers, which are wonderful if you're trying to think at it. You want some help thinking out of the box, creating new information. It's what elevates it beyond older models that just very strictly followed rules that were put in place. If A, then B, then B, then C. If C, then D. Therefore, if A, then D. And, very good, always correct, but it doesn't really add to the conversation. And it helps with thinking works. You have a patient comes in and complex set of symptoms and signs, and you're trying to figure out what the diagnosis is. We're now developing models that are very good at this, and statistically better than many clinicians. And yet, clinicians are still ultimately responsible for those diagnostic decisions. And so we have to keep these things in mind, and the very things that make it creative also create hallucinations, falsehoods, things that may be stated as fact and yet are fiction, right? So the other thing is that these things may be culturally transformative. We tend to, in our society, but especially in healthcare, we like to be careful about changes because we're worried about risk and these kinds of transformations may completely change approaches. And as you see, one of those changes is to confidentiality. Pre-trained, it's pre-trained on data. And so as one text that I read said, it's pre-trained on the good, the bad, the ugly of human thought, right? So if there's bias in the training set, there's bias in the system. right? And so you have that, and then even attempts. It's working on probabilities, but it's not working in a linear fashion. So you can try to adjust, as some programs have done. There's an Adobe Firefly where they noticed that some of the other programs that were doing photorealistic images and analyzing them, and you put in a question like, show me images of American physicians, and in blanking on the name of the first program, but the first program showed only 14 or was it only 14% of the images were women, whereas at the time 36% of American physicians were women. Adobe Firefly reviewers decided to try to fix that, to make the set representative of the proportionality of American physicians based on race and gender. And but then they got results back. 50% of the images, when you put in the query, were women, but only 36% of the images of the American medical population is female. So, and then so the adjustment had a problem. So we have issues like this with the training sets, and then there's additional things in that the training sets consistently get new information, so that the information often automatically gets uploaded into the system. And we have in healthcare this idea of the patient retaining control of their medical information, and deciding how it's going to be shared and with whom. And this is just being uploaded into, they're trying to de-identify it, but we've discovered that it's easily re-identifiable. So confidentiality is not being protected, right? So then the T in Chat GPT is transformers. So it's the idea of, if you think of like a neural network, and, I mentioned that AI is not linear. So, I like to think of this like translation. So you want to talk to a program. Okay. And you want the program to give you answers back in English about, say, a patient's diagnosis. Well, how do you get the program to understand it? Well, the program has to translate it into its own language system, which is binary, zeros and ones. And then it has to decide, how finite, like how many words are going to be in its language, right? And then what words are going to be grouped together to create concepts. So you have, and then what's the grammar, and what are the semantics, and and so you have all these interconnections, right? And they all give a flavor. Some programmers call it a temperature for the information, and then you can adjust that as the programmer, in the creation, but that adjusts how the information is handled and returned and such. And anyone that's, if you go back to the translation analogy, anyone that's done, used a family member instead of a professional translator for an informed consent discussion knows the difficulties and the value of professional translation, because you can have someone who can speak fluently, or you think so, and but then certain concepts don't translate as easily, and so that can transform the information. And if you think about something like facial recognition, one of the things that they discovered is that, and this was partly due to the training set, but it's also in the nodes and the parameters that were set, what identifies, defining features of a face, and how does it translate? So, you have a pixel and you start to get into skin color, and then but then if the language is so focused on skin color, and it's trained on only one skin color, or primarily one, then it has trouble identifying other skin colors. And so then you start to get bias coming in that way. And whole populations are, can't use the technology, or the technology does not work well. And so we have to start understanding, in part, how this technology works, or how to hire people who understand how the technology works, in order to make good decisions. Anything from buying a specific program interface for a healthcare system, to understanding in identifying potential weaknesses when you get information back, and strengths. So what kind of system do you want to use, and how do you improve it and such? Because anytime you have new technology, it is potentially transformative for the culture, but you hope that, or at least I, as an ethicist, hope that that we fix some of the problems from the past, and it becomes put in place in a way that it not only doesn't exacerbate existing inequities in our system, and problems, but maybe helps us solve some of them. So, and that's why you'll see some of the principles that we're going to need are epistemic humility, understanding what you don't know, the limits of what you know, and asking for help, and being transparent about the use of technology, and explaining its use, and getting input from multiple stakeholders, those who are impacted by its use. Right. So your basic ethical principles, they're not going to be as simple as something like the Georgetown mantra of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, right? Although those principles still apply, but we also we need to think of competence. And by competence, I mean competent use of the technology, as well as understanding where professional competence and professional integrity needs to step in, and not over rely on letting the machines do the work, right? Epistemic humility, understanding, like I said, the limits of one's knowledge, and honesty, truth, and reliability, because these are big challenges depending on which system you use and choose and what you're looking for. Transparency, being open and honest about the use of technology, because you can't identify problems if you're not being honest about its use. But also transparency in these are companies, and they may be able to make a lot of money if they get opted, but they need to be transparent with healthcare systems people, and so that we see inside the black box, so we can see how these things work as much as we know, and then even understanding what, just like healthcare, understanding what we don't know and where those limits are. It's a way to reduce risk and improve empowerment. And structural justice, representation, and inclusion. We need to really, not just put these into words and play with it, but really, think about who's going to be impacted by this technology, and they need to be at the table, understanding, participating in development, review, analysis, and then confidentiality. We have to discuss confidentiality. And what does confidentiality mean if we have these large databases where, student papers get automatically fed in and then uploaded into a database that the students can never pull it from adequately, and they don't have a say and they don't have power over this. And so what does it mean if we say someone has a right to their personal work and the privacy of their coursework, if it's then being fed in and then used by large corporations to train their new product, right? So we need to, and then that goes back to transparency. We need people to understand what's going on. And so there are more people involved in the creation and regulation of the technology, right? So I split it out into, I really think that all of these principles apply to all of these areas, but ones that stand out a lot. So education, I think we really need to prepare students for future AI use, so that they understand, even something as simple as, making a choice about which, depending on what you want the AI system to do, you may not want, to use the same, chat GPT for every time you need, AI to help you with writing. There certain programs are better for certain things than others. I gave the example of you have writer's block and you just want to just run off some ideas. And so a more creative leaning system might be useful for that. Whereas if you're looking for something to help you smooth out your language, because English is only your third language, then you then you put it. You may use a different system. The clear, transparent expectations. The competent, informed use that's consistent with integrity and purpose. You can't don't tell students that they can't use AI and then you use it for the grading. That's a little hypocritical. Fair and reliable representation. Clarify and protect confidentiality and property rights, especially for those that have limited choice in the matter. Research and scholarship, follow the current rules and standards. And this is important because, different granting agencies have different rules. For many military grants, they don't want you using any AI because they're very, very afraid about the uploading of classified information, right, outside of their control. And understanding what those regulations and rules are helps you stay within the parameters of what is permissible. Being transparent about the use. So that if someone says, you used AI inappropriately, you can explain, well, I used it for this purpose, and this that was acceptable. Say something like a grammar check, or that the use is consistent and supportive of the goals of research and scholarship, fair choice, and representation of study population. This is a classic in research ethics, but it also comes into play with AI, and actually the harm can be exacerbated. And as we saw with the one example with Adobe Firefly, it can be exacerbated even when the intent is the opposite. Epistemic humility. Don't be afraid to ask. Ask those that know more about this. Protecting confidentiality and the property rights includes some understanding of how AI works, because you don't know when to ask. If you don't know anything, then you don't know when to ask. So you need to know at least enough to be able to know when, I really need to bring in an expert in this one. When in doubt, err on the side of avoiding harm. If you think this might create a problem with confidentiality, maybe take a step back. Recognize that AI can create, change, connect, and review data. So with research, you want everything to be, you're looking at your data as being a reflection of truth, of something that's reliable, that can be replicated, right? And fabrication, falsification, and fraud are the holy sin trinity for research ethics, right? And AI doesn't understand that, right? So you need to help it with that. Healthcare, keep in mind that care for the patient comes first, and there may be there are a lot of incentives to start to use AI. It saves time, saves money, and in sometimes it's more accurate. depending on what is being asked of it, right? But there's also a value, healthcare, it has an art component, and, knowing things or understanding, AI is not going to understand that, recommending bed rest to a woman that's got 3 young kids at home is really not very valuable to her, right? You need to sit down, talk with her about, okay, is this realistic? What can we do to help? AI is not going to understand it. It's just going to give that recommendation. And then if she doesn't follow it, she may be identified as, non-compliant, right? But that's not really the full story. So you can't let blame AI for a failure to act as a clinician. Understanding professional. So this goes in with the professional expertise and accountability, following current rules and standards. Things are going to change, and they may not keep up. They won't. Let's face it, right? But you can start to become part of the discussion, and but in the process, understand that rules and standards are often there to protect the most vulnerable in this system, and that's often the patients. Be transparent about the use, and make sure that the use continues to be consistent and supportive of the goals of research, scholarship, and healthcare. So things like, if someone put in a parameter of success as being the patient being able to walk out of the hospital. And what does this mean for patients that were not able to walk prior to coming into the hospital? I mean, that's their normal thing. Well, now you've already put them behind, set them up as a failure in healthcare, when that may not be at all what the true thing is. So fair and just choice representation of populations. And as I said, epistemic humility, it's hard, we need a certain amount of bravado to be able to care for patients. But humility is also very valuable. And then protecting confidentiality, it just comes up again and again, because it is the generative aspect is a strength and a weakness. So now we're going to talk about the case study. I'm going to hand this over to Fran.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay in the room?
Yes.
Connie, you need to stand by the podium to advance the slides.
Okay. I'm just
Okay.
grabbing my notes.
Stretching your legs, I see. Yeah. So the approach, the goal of this presentation is to sort of give a structure to a possible approach that you can use to not only build your own ethical lens when using AI, but also in helping to support your students in developing this ethical lens, so that when they're using AI, they are also keeping in mind the issues that Connie has started to scratch the surface on for us here today. So we're proposing that a structure. We have this template here for exploring a case study that would help the students start looking more deeply into the use of AI and the ethical issues that need to be considered. So the structure is, as you see here, with a scenario and background, telling the story, then having the learners stop and think for a moment about okay, how do you approach this? What are some of the ethical issues and approaches that need to be considered when examining this scenario? And then what are the concerns and issues? Then what would be the institutional and regulatory response and subsequent consequences associated with this situation? And then an opportunity for discussion and exploration of the lessons learned. Next slide, please. So we're going to walk you through this scenario here. We're applying it to that template that I shared with you, and we have this scenario here, which is looking at privacy in healthcare, AI, and the use of AI. And as you can see here, I'm not going to read it verbatim, but there was an arrangement between UK's National Health Services and Google's DeepMind to use data to help predict and help physicians identify, early on and manage acute kidney injury. And so when you're managing big data like this, you definitely having the use of a tool like that AI offers to start analyzing this data and picking up nuances that would be impossible for physicians to utilize in real time. So this seemed really like, really a wonderful opportunity, right? So, but of course, it was discovered that DeepMind had been granted access to the entire personal health records of approximately 1.6 million patients without their knowledge of this. So the next slide, which I'll let Connie talk about as we follow our template.
Okay, so what would be the approach to use? I mean, how would you assess the ethics of this situation? So the basics are the government, the National Health Service, made a deal with the AI company to buy this app and use it to help clinicians detect and manage acute kidney injury. But what was unbeknownst was that the app then was granted access to the patient records of everyone in the National Health Service. Right, because that's how it's getting this information, and that's how it's improving the app as it went along. And is there an ethical problem?
Yeah, of course. There's an ethical problem. I would take it from the aspect of if it was they just transported the patient's data into that system, then there might be identifiable things that are connected to patients. So in that regard, if we get loose of the AI company, if we don't have access to them anymore, someone has to regulate that.
Right.
How do we get back those details? So I think that's an ethical concern. And more importantly, they did not even send out messages to the patients. So that's a breach.
Yeah, the National Health Service, it's funded by taxpayer dollars. And and people didn't know that no one gave permission to send this to it. What is the gene therapy, the gene testing company 21andMe is dealing with this now, because it's going bankrupt and going to be sold off. Someone's going to buy it. But we don't know what whoever buys 23andMe is going to do with the data that it will, whatever entity buys this will now own. And that is the genetic data of everyone that has uploaded genetic material to 23andMe. And so people are discovering that they've lost control of their genetic data. So it's a similar kind of problem. And, this is being done to help, physicians in in very specific instances. But it's going beyond that. And I love that comment about yeah. So, how do you get that control back?
Mm-hmm.
And we're not very good at that part. And so what else, and what kind of information is included in someone's, health record? It's not even just your health information. Social information, demographic information, it's a big problem. So, would this kind of app be able to be used ethically? And how would you do that? That's what I'm trying to like.
Yeah. So I don't know, but in the US, there's HIPAA, like something, a regulatory board.
Yeah.
In terms of things like that. So I think the best way to go is to set up a board like that who will be in charge of monitoring, data sharing, and those things. I think that's the best way. That's the most ethical approach to use.
So maybe requiring some kind of legal document, and then you can't always control against bad actors, but at least if you had an agreement, but you would also have to have people like people have to give permission to use their health data. And then you have the common problem that, people treat it like agreeing to an app that they download on their phone. Not many people read it, read the privacy notice. And, if you think that you need to agree in order to get health care, is that a voluntary agreement? So that, there are problems with HIPAA as well. But yeah, you can try with that. You can try to develop, work with Google to develop a way to de-identify information in a way that is more difficult to re-identify, because they really don't need the identification part. And they really only, it may be that they need a lot of the health information part, but they probably don't need. It gets a little difficult because it could be a public health issue. And then, so you might need that demographic information, but, it's the demographic information that starts to make the re-identification easier, right? And that because people start going, oh, well, how many people with this condition live in this area? And then, and next thing you know, you have, as we had once at Hahnemann, a student look up and realize that they were talking about her aunt who had not told anyone about her terminal cancer. Right. And everyone had tried to be very confidential. Yeah. So I think this is one of the challenges that we have is like, we want to be, and we are using some of these CDSSs. Let me think. Clinical diagnostic. What's the something systems, right? Right. But there are systems out there that we're using to help with clinical diagnosis, and they're very good, and they're very very helpful in general. But yeah, then that part of how do you try to keep the confidentiality part.
Did the app actually provide benefit too? I mean, there's the whole ethical issue of the privacy, which is its own thing. But then, did the app even work?
It turned out that the let me see if this is the same. Yeah, it turned out the app was started to be used instead of the clinician. Right. So on a social standpoint, it started to, apps like this started to be used kind of like a virtual meeting with it. And some people thought it was going to lead to a reduction in the healthcare force and a reduction in the number of physical in-community clinics, right? And longer wait times for those in-person meetings. So, but yeah. Okay, so but you see how you have to think beyond just the individual patient care, and then start thinking social impacts and legal agreements, and how do we get the data back, and how would you get consent? I mean, is this something that you could do ahead of time, kind of like we do with emergency research, where we go out into the areas of the locations where the paramedics are going to be going and talk to the communities, and so people have input into, hopefully you do it early enough so they have input into the design of the study and as well as the process, and then they get information after the fact. And so even if the specific individual isn't able to give consent, you've had stakeholders input. So that might have solved some problems. Fran, are we ready for the next slide?
Yes.
Yeah. So the partnership raised widespread concern over patient privacy and data collection.
So there were some key ethical issues that arose, and some of them have been touched on in the discussion here. Can you just click to advance the first bullet? certainly the first one was the lack of transparency and consent. We were talking about that. Patients were not informed about sharing their data, and nor were they offered an opportunity to either consent or opt out, which is what's a standard protocol that we have currently in place. Next, can you click again? The scope of the data, that was an issue. DeepMind received a large amount of data, more than they needed to do what they needed for this project. So they had access to the entire health record for the individuals. So that's another piece to consider is, again, what is the scope of this study or the project, and making sure that you're staying within that scope and no more, no less. And as Connie touched upon about, de-identifying. The third one we also talked about when you were talking about 23andMe, the commercial third-party involvement raises a lot of concerns because they're for profit, right? So that introduces concerns about potential commercialization. And then who owns the data after that, like 23andMe? Now, who's going to get access to this genetic pool of data? So those things raise some significant concerns, and they're long-term concerns when you're thinking about the viability of particular companies, if they're going to be existing, what's their commitment to protecting that data. Click again, please. And then there's the issue of trust and data governance. This really this incident exposed the weakness in how the healthcare institutions manage the data, which is something to really keep in mind. How are they proactively going to be managing their data? And also, it eroded public confidence, and trust in digital technologies. When you have something like this, there's parts of us that, because of the ubiquitous nature of AI, are accustomed to the conveniences that it offers us, but things like these data breaches, more or less, really do erode public confidence and trust within the healthcare system. Okay, so thank you for the next slide. So what should be considered here when we're talking about the institutional response and the consequences? Now we're talking about not just in this case, it's, the National Health Institute. What should be considered? What are some of the factors?
Yeah, I think as you mentioned, one of the difficulties here is it's the government, right? So people don't have a lot of, other than with the ballot box, I think one of the things the healthcare professionals probably need to do is to help the public, help inform the public about it, and why they should, what they should, what the risks are, what the potential benefits, how it may differ from the electronic health record, because you don't want people opting out of the electronic health record, which can be, I don't know how it functions in Great Britain. When I was there, it was all paper, right? You can get better care if you use your electronic health record. But no one's going to use that if they don't trust it. Right.
Exactly. Next slide. Okay, hit enter. Okay, so the first thing, again, as far as the response you've touched on, to strengthen the NHS trust was required to improve its communication with patients regarding data use. So they have to reinforce, have to sort of gain back the trust and clearer transparency with patients. Click. there needed to be some governance reforms, so they're instructed to put stronger data sharing agreements and ethical review processes before data is shared, before these agreements are initiated and executed. Next one. And then public accountability. So this sparks a wider national conversation in the role of private tech firms in public healthcare and standards, and that these standards should be in place to govern these partnerships. So that's the impact, what happened in response to this incident. Next slide. Okay, the lessons learned here. Again, transparency and consent. That's something that Connie has repeatedly reinforced throughout this presentation, and how important that it is that there has to be this clear explanation and transparency, especially when there are third parties involved. Next one. Having the scope really clearly defined, so AI projects and any project, when we're talking about health information in this scenario here, but it could be with other scenarios that we could encounter in the future, it has to be limited to only the data that's necessary for the specific objectives. Next one. And regulatory compliance. So all the regulations have to be in place, and there has to be a mechanism for ensuring compliance and monitoring. I think that's a piece that's essential for us. We were talking about HIPAA before. I admit that I don't know all the nuances of HIPAA, but I think that in this day and age, some of the specifics related, I have a very broad understanding of what the HIPAA regulations are, but this may necessitate us having a deeper dive and really understanding the details of the HIPAA protections, as well as other regulatory protections that are in place, and if there are any gaps identified, and ask those tough questions. Now, we had planned to have an opportunity for a small group work, but what we'll end up doing is sharing with you the handout that goes with the small group work, as well as the summaries that accompany these case studies. They will be distributed at the when Darren sends out the PowerPoint to everybody who's attended. But I'd like to use the last it looks like 7 minutes that we have for discussion, questions, and just kind of any debrief related to the scenario that we presented.
Any other questions?
A question.
Yeah.
So a lot of the discussion has centered around using AI and sort of data security and data management and data transfer. Do you think there's any solution in which a program or an application is housed entirely internally so that no data is leaving the institution that owns the data?
Well, I think we see that with to some extent, not that no data leaves like an Epic system, but yeah, and a lot of we've designed a lot of the hospital electronic records systems so that you can't, much to the chagrin of like residents that, they can't go home and do their notes at home, that kind of thing,
actually a very important question that you're posing there. And many institutions are developing their own AI tools, and there's a lot of work being done and a lot of investment in developing their own AI specialists within the organization. So, and that's not just in healthcare, that there's a movement towards that, but also in corporations, business, because again, all of the data that a corporation or an entity has is proprietary. And of course, they don't want that to be out there. So the way to circumvent that breach or potential breach is to put in place those kinds of mechanisms and do the analytics and that AI support in-house.
Yeah, Yet you want other, other health systems to be able to have access, right? So that if you have a heart attack and you're not home, and you're in a different system, but they can get onto the health and they can access what medications you have and what other medical conditions you have and all of that. And yet there needs to be a way that still remains somehow, there's a control, so that's used for the patient's benefit. But however, we're also transforming towards a learning health system, which uses, so it incorporates clinical care with research and quality improvement in developing protocols and such. And so that requires the use of clinical care data within the institution. And yet then you might publish papers, and then so I think it goes back to, we need that national conversation, and then we need to look at the de-identification process. See whether we can use the same minds that are helping us build these systems can also look at, is it possible for us to, effectively de-identify data? So, because if it's not connected to the individual, then it's okay, right? Because it's not your personal information, and that's the real difficulty because things are moving more towards genetics, which is inherently identifiable.
It's also that with large computer models, if somebody has a database of the health record and another database that has enough cross information, they can build their own third database or build their own queries based on their multiple databases, form the large model.
Right. And then
regardless of how isolated and separated your individual data might be, once it's out there in the wild, it can be brokered into a million different directions.
To that point, if that second database has identifiers in it and they can cross-reference enough of the de-identified information with the identified information, suddenly it's not de-identified.
Then it's just
right. And that's what hackers do, right? So that's why, I am epistemically humble. I do not know. I don't have this, I need experts that understand these systems and that can look at how, there's a technical obstacle to do the ideal ethical
and we would have a better understanding of what are the questions that we need to ask about the ethics of these processes.
Right. And why is confidentiality so important? And part of that is because of the potential for danger. Part of that is there's also a recognition that, I talked about cultural transformation. We are, my son isn't, in some ways, he's more savvy to confidentiality breaches, and in other ways, he's much less concerned. And it may be that we get to a point where the idea of what information is dangerous has changed. Right? So maybe our work has to be in really promoting our ability to defend against genetic discrimination, for example, because the little legislation that we have is not very effective. It may be that we have to really think in a different way. I don't know. That's a good question.
Well, thank you, Connie. Thank you, Fran. Thanks for joining us for today's Tuesday topic. See you guys next time.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.